Welcome, everybody. I'm Ted Jackson, co-founder of ClearPoint Strategy, and I'm joined today by Ryan Wherrity, Senior Sales Manager.
Hey, everyone.
And Marisa Sailus, Senior Technical Account Manager from our Customer Success team.
Hi, everyone.
Today, we're going to talk about some exciting new research we're doing at ClearPoint. And Ryan and Marisa are going to bring some of that research to life. Let me share my screen. Before we get started, I just wanted to say that this webinar will be recorded and we can send it out to anyone that missed it or wants to see some of the data again. Also, we want you to please put in comments, questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to respond live.
So we've looked at ClearPoint usage over the last 8 years. We've extracted and anonymized that data that we have. We've been able to analyze over 20,000 strategic plans, over 117,000 objectives, 300,000 measures, and 200,000 milestones. It's the largest strategy execution data set we've ever seen, and it reveals one big truth.
Truth is organizations have mastered planning, but they're still struggling with execution. This has been something we've talked about since I went to work for Drs. Norton and Kaplan right out of business school more than 25 years ago. But now we can see it in the data. When you hear that 9 out of 10 organizations are failing to execute strategy, we can see those statistics right here. Some high-level things we can see are as follows. Top performers complete the vast majority of projects or initiatives over the course of the year, like a 93% completion rate. This occurs in the top 5.7% of organizations, and it's no accident. These organizations have discipline, systems, and accountability around their strategy, and this results in a 7x performance gap to the low performers. We studied the difference between that 93% completion rate and the 12.5% completion rate. And we came up with 4 big insights we're calling Megatrends. We'll unpack them over the course of this webinar.
Perfect. And, of course, we're going to cover these in detail, but I just wanted to give a quick summary of the 4 trends that we've seen over the time period. So just so everyone's on the same page. So we're calling these, 1, the execution opportunity. 2, the focus premium, the accountability advantage, and then the cadence competency, right? So I know we're kind of moving through this fast. There's going to be a lot of data up on the screen, but we've got a lot to cover. We'll send out the report to everyone that attended the webinar after we get off today.
So let's talk about this execution opportunity. As you can see from the chart, we've broken down our averages by industry. As I stated earlier, we only see a 15% completion rate of projects, but on the left side, we see that energy and utility companies do better, like 5 times better than nonprofit organizations in completing goals. Remember, these are the averages. The highest performers complete more than 90% of their initiatives. This data has been trending up over time, but we still see the averages as pretty low. The high performers are treating project management as a core discipline, and they're pushing to link these projects to key objectives. They've stopped trying to plan everything they could do and instead commit to finishing 75% of what they will do. The takeaway, systems beat heroics.
Right. I think that makes a lot of sense, Ted. And just to add some color to this, I was thinking of a county out in the Midwest that I met with recently. And, these guys, they had pages and pages of initiatives, right? So think like a list of really great ideas, but no real follow through behind them. So we just, we worked with them. We helped them to take a hard look at what was actually doable. We trimmed that list down. We trimmed it down to about 1/3 of the ideas that they originally had, and really kind of pushed everything through ClearPoint's workflows. So fast forward about a year from then, their completion rate jumped from 17% to, I think it was around like 46% completion. And it wasn't just like flipping a switch or magic. It was just kind of the focus and consistency and getting on that cadence.
Wow, Ryan, really what a difference that simplicity can make in organizations. I mean, we see that on the client side of things all the time. On a similar note, we work with a lot of organizations who kind of experience just that problem. But one that comes to mind is a major utility that we work with. They manage an enormous amount of operational work, but what they actually track and report out on in ClearPoint is intentionally small, just truly the strategic projects. Each department reports out on no more than 1 to 5 initiatives. That focus is really what makes them successful. So every project in ClearPoint gets the attention. Updates actually drive the right conversations, and leaders can immediately see whether strategy is moving forward. Over time, that discipline has really built a culture of finishing, and they've become one of our most consistent high performers because of it.
This next slide shows completion rates over time. You can see that at the beginning of COVID, there was a slight drop in completion rates, but then it went up and peaked in 2022. With a lot more uncertainty, there's a stronger focus on the initiatives people could control, and completion rates almost doubled. These don't seem like big numbers, but a doubling of the completion rate shows a really nice change in behavior.
Yeah, and what I think is important here as well is that this trend tells us something. When organizations align around a manageable set of priorities and reinforce consistent follow-through, they can materially increase execution regardless of circumstances. And, here you can see the breakdown by performance tier as well. So our high performers are consistently completing more than 90% of their initiatives, as we've said. So even though the overall percentage is around that 15%, it's not because everyone struggled. It's really far from it. A significant group of organizations built discipline, relied on repeatable processes, and kept finishing what they started. And that consistency is really what pushed their completion rates so far above the rest.
Yeah, Marisa, and I think that's really what we would expect, right? Organizations that kind of build the habit of finishing work on time, that they do it reliably. They don't just complete more initiatives, they outperform across the board, right? So the systems and discipline behind execution are really what we've seen help to be able to separate those high performers.
Okay, so what's our takeaway from this first trend? I think great results are possible. And if you're not achieving them, then we do have a few steps that you can take. I think you should audit your completion rate for the past 12 months. And if it's below 20%, you should treat it like a fire alarm. Consider cutting the number of initiatives you're working on, then add new ones only when you fully complete your current ones. And think about how you communicate your initiatives. Put a completion goal in your project plan and celebrate teams that are completing projects on time. Let people know you're watching the initiatives by requiring regular updates with a red, yellow, green status and a % complete at minimum for each reporting period. So, any questions?
Yeah, Ted, I actually had one. I saw that your question there in the chat, and I think a lot of times organizations that don't complete their projects, they kind of just dust them under the rug and try to move on. So, in your experience, I was just wondering what you think an organization should do about the projects that they maybe can't complete.
Yeah, I think it depends on the type of project, because some projects need additional resources. Like you may need additional money or people for those. And if you can get the funding, then you can just change the due date and you can keep charging at it. Whereas other projects are not achieving the results that you want, and you realize the project's just not going to work. If you have a lot of these, consider implementing a stage gate process. So your projects need to go through particular decision points or gates before you can move them on. This way you know when to stop a project before you're wasting more resources. So each stage is like an opportunity to reflect on that project. For strategy execution work, you can complete a project by stopping it early or by extending the deadline. What you want to avoid is really just project abandonment. When you stop reporting, you don't learn anything. You're likely to repeat your mistakes with other projects in the future, and you end up sending the message to the rest of your organization that tracking your strategic projects just really isn't that important.
Okay, so it sounds like what you're trying to say is that it's all right to stop a project that could still mark that as complete. That's probably better than just abandoning it outright.
I think so. And whether you mark it as like we're finished with this project, so we want to take all of our resources off of it and then start working on different projects, or just reassign your resources. That'll allow you to push things forward that are working.
Makes sense.
Okay, let's turn to the focus premium and let's look at a little bit of data. So with focus, let's get ready to prioritize.
Perfect. So if we're looking at this chart, let's first try to just look at the baseline there, right? So the chart here, it shows the average number of elements across scorecards over time, right? So you can see that bottom line, the objectives, it stays pretty steady. It even dips a little bit, but the measures and projects, they hold flat for years, right? Until around 2020, you can see that those start to climb. They jump up about 50%. And milestones, that top row up there, they jump nearly 70% in the same period. So Marisa, Ted, and I, we were looking through this, and really kind of what that tells us is that organizations, they didn't just suddenly start creating like more goals overnight, right? They actually kept the goals pretty tight, and instead they put a lot more like substance behind them, if you will. So like more measures, more detail around the projects, milestones, and the things that were needed to move things forward.
Yeah, and kind of building off of what Ryan, you just highlighted there, when we really break this down by industry, you can really see how different planning environments influence the structure of a strategic plan. As you can see here, government, education, and energy organizations, they consistently carry more measures, more projects, and a lot more milestones. These sectors operate under, heavy compliance and external reporting requirements, so it's pretty natural for them to track more details and maintain broader portfolios. However, when we look at industries like manufacturing, professional services, they run a lot leaner. Their portfolios tend to stay tighter and more focused, reflecting on cultures that really favor that agility and quicker decision-making that we typically see. And really what's interesting is that these patterns aren't necessarily about doing more or doing less. They're about doing what each industry needs to stay accountable. And it tees up an important point that Ted will touch on next. So regardless of industry, the organizations that perform the best are the ones that find the right size portfolio, not just the biggest one.
Yeah, and I think Alfred in the chat teed up this question that I'm going to try to hit next, which is, what is the research shown, like the difference between the high performers and the low performers? So, it's showing that high performers don't just do more, right? So when we look at the initial data that Ryan showed, not everyone is doing, a ton more measures or a ton more projects and initiatives, right? The high performers are doing just enough, right? We're seeing like a 5, 9, 8, 17 model. 5 goals, 9 measures, 8 projects, 17 milestones. Milestones are the steps kind of within the projects. So this doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, 5, 9, 8, 17, but it does show where organizations are really excelling. They don't try to do too much, but they try to create plans that are manageable and achievable, and that's what keeps people motivated.
Right. And just kind of thinking back almost a year ago, this is probably back in January of this year, myself and another colleague, we were working with a regional health system outside of Denver. And these folks, they had 26 strategic goals, right? So probably more than any organization should realistically have. It's just impossible to manage because no one can really look at that and see what the real priorities were. So similar to that Midwest County example I shared earlier, we helped them to be able to cut it down to 7 goals, 9 key measures, right? And their board had some really kind of instant feedback, right? They had a clear picture of what mattered, and the buy-in was almost overnight.
That's great. It's
Yeah,
always
Ryan.
nice to see. Oh, go ahead, Marisa.
You're good. Yeah, no, Ryan, I was just going to kind of piggyback off of that. Like, we see a lot of different strategic plans come through the door with our customer success team here. A lot of different types of strategic plans. One that really kind of comes to mind is an airport that we worked with. When they initially came to us, they had about 8 layers of detail in their strategic plan. They had objectives, measures, KPIs of objectives, KPIs of tactics. Like, it was a very confusing plan to try to kind of pick apart and figure out how they were going to manage it. So once we actually simplified it down, we took it into really like 4 cascading levels that really had clear alignment. Everything finally clicked into place, and the teams really finally understood the plan. The leaders got a lot more clarity around what they were actually tracking and what their priorities were. And then the whole portfolio then became manageable again. And that's really the message of this slide. If you really want that same shift, here's what leaders really need to do now. Strengthen your execution architecture, sequence work. So you're only pushing the 5 now that truly matter. Audit that portfolio with that 5, 9, 8, 17 benchmark to cut that overload, and then build the visibility and tracking to really make sure progress stays on course. So as we've said, that pattern is consistent. Simplify the structure, focus the work, and then everything finally comes executable.
Yeah, Marisa, I like where you're going with it. It's really simplify before trying to make it more robust. And that's where I was going to cut in earlier about the Ryan example, but your example showcased it just as much, which is sometimes the strategy is in like one person's head and it seems to be all perfect, but it's just really complicated. So the rest of the organization can't pick it up. And so either simplifying it at one level and then having additional levels, or just coming up with the vital few metrics to look at, it could be enough for your organization to stay focused. So I see we got another question of, from Nada, what's a good number of strategic goals and objectives under each goal could there be? So I'm gonna rephrase that and say, like, when I think of goals, I think of goals within a plan. And I think of a plan at a different level in an organization. So I think of like the enterprise level of an organization shouldn't really have more than like 5 to 8 goals in it. But then a division or a department can have an additional 5 to 8 goals, some of which are going to directly link up to that enterprise, and some are going to be slightly different. But each group, like that division, and even a department within the division, are only going to end up having that 5 to 8 goals. That's what allows people to focus and allows them to drive forward. And I think in Marisa's airport example, you could see it kind of, instead of trying to do everything in one place, it was moved to the appropriate divisions and departments. And then the second part of that is when you think about KPIs or measures beneath that, I like to think about, really 1 to 2 KPIs for each goal. And people like to view data in different ways. So sometimes they choose more, but I think, if you start with more, right, you got to ask yourself, does that additional measure or that additional KPI drive a different discussion in your organization? Does it provide additional strategic insight, or is it just extremely highly correlated with your other measure? So it moves up, it moves down at the exact same way that the other one does. If so, then you don't really need those extra measures for your strategy review. You may need them to track your daily operations, but they shouldn't come up and into that strategy review meeting. So any other questions that I might have missed in there, guys, gals?
No other questions. I was just going to throw something in, Ted. I think, we do this every day, meaning strategic goals, measures, initiatives, right? And I think it's okay if you have too many measures and, you kind of can look yourself in the mirror at the end of the year, end of the quarter, and say, hey, this is way too many. We even did that recently with our own ClearPoint scorecard, right? I know we went through a kind of an exercise of being able to simplify things that maybe move the same way as another measure or metric does. So, you can start somewhere and then sort of trim the fat from there.
Yeah, I mean, we right now operate with 7 measures, and I think we have, or sorry, 7 goals, and I think we have maybe 10 measures total. Like, does that mean we're managing our entire organization with those 10? No, but it means we can go into a quarterly business review and look at that and talk about our challenges and our opportunities in our organization.
There's another question that just came in, Ted, around strategy maps. Like, how often are we seeing them actually, quote unquote, really used?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think strategy maps, came into vogue with the balanced scorecard, of course, so that's where you would primarily see them. But there are a lot of other management frameworks that don't include the balanced scorecard, right? And so even though, our background might be from a Norton Kaplan scorecard level, but what we see is people still do goals and they still do measures and they still do projects. They might not call them balanced scorecard. They might call it a entrepreneurial operating system or OKRs, or we've seen a few people use like a V2 MOM framework. But ultimately, you're looking at what are we trying to accomplish and how are we measuring it and what's driving it forward, which ends up being those initiatives and projects. So I see maybe 30 or 40% of organizations using some form of a strategy map. And what we think about that is just a big communication tool, right? Is some people, when they see, Excel spreadsheets or other things in table format, they kind of tune out or they struggle to process it. So that's great for some people, but then the map provides that visual, which helps other people as well. So good questions. Thanks for putting those in. Let's move on to this third megatrend, the accountability advantage, right? And to me, I think these are some of the most painful stats in the report, which is seeing 74% of goals have no owner, or 71% of measures are unassigned, or 57% of projects lack clear ownership. So let me dig into this a little bit more as we start to address this, right? Because when you look at this chart on the left, it shows that just under a third of elements have owners, right? Like we define, this is where we get into some of the definitions around some of this data, right? Because we define this as making one person, an individual, responsible for the goal, the measure or the project. So we've also seen this idea of a phantom ownership crisis. So some items are owned, but they don't get updated. We see that in the right-hand side, right? And a lot of this are showing that organizations are good at planning, but they're bad at taking action, right? So before you completely freak out about this data, we're talking about individual ownership, not ownership by committee. So when we see something like marketing owns an objective, we don't really count that in the data as real ownership, right? Because how many times have you received an email that asks a question or asks for data, but you see the email was sent to multiple people? So, you can disregard those or ignore those emails because the email says, like, hey, Ted, how many people attended the webinar this week? Like that's something I'm going to respond to because it's addressed to me. But if it's just like sent out, how many people attended the webinar? Like, should Ryan answer that? Should Marisa answer that? Should I answer that? Should our marketing team that put on this webinar answer that? So I'm like, I'm really busy. I'm not necessarily going to answer that. So we don't see that as like real ownership. So we want to see individuals taking ownership, and we can see the results in the data.
Right. And kind of one thing that we're also seeing as well is, even when we do have owners, we have that clear alignment. If it's not incorporated into like the overall processes or the organizational culture, only 14% of those really are actually making updates within 90 days. So even if the ownership exists on paper, sometimes it might not kind of fully follow through in practice. So this is really why we call ownership that hidden variable in execution. The moment we fix that active ownership, getting the right person assigned, and actually engaged with making those updates, so in putting the percent complete, the red, yellow, green statuses, things like that, those completion rates will jump dramatically. We've consistently seen them triple really once that real ownership takes hold.
And I saw there were a couple, one question around frameworks. I mean, there's really a ton. We can share some additional information around that following the call, but, Ted mentioned Balanced Scorecard, OKR, Hoshin Connery, Blue Ocean, Pestle Analysis. There's really quite a bit of sort of breadth to strategic frameworks nowadays. We can certainly share more resources. I think it was Maria who might have asked that, but thanks for flipping the screen here. And I promise that we're not trying to overwhelm you all with data, but this chart, this is trying to show owners and collaborators per plan by industry, right? On average, if we look at some of those charts there, what this is showing us is that there's about 3 true owners per plan, and then around a dozen collaborators within that plan. So that kind of tells you that strategy isn't broadly owned, that people are helping, sure, right? But only a small group is actually carrying the weight. But there is hope, right? So the best sustainable fix for that we have seen is maintaining just a clear ownership structure and process. And just to throw in another quick example, one of the manufacturing clients that we had worked with, they had more than 100 projects, really kind of no clear lead behind those projects. Some of them were, like a specific group owns it, as Ted was sort of mentioning earlier, right? If everyone owns it, then really no one owns it. But once their CEO said, like, hey, every goal gets one owner and one update each quarter, everything seemingly clicked with them. They didn't hire anybody new, right? They just made the ownership visible and accountable. And that alone really helped to completely change their execution rhythm.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback off of that, I think one thing that can also be helpful to think about is, projects, when you think of those, it might not be just one person who's actually involved in the actual work. There's a lot of other people that might be happening behind the scenes or reviewing the work that has been being done. So one large energy organization that we support, they built a really disciplined ownership model into every single one of their projects. So each one of their initiatives had an executive sponsor. They would review and approve the information. They have a project manager. That's the person inputting those actual updates. And then they have a defined project team. So the project manager goes to that project team and requests any updates that they might not kind of have from their perspective. So they have that really clear approval path for entering those updates. And then everyone really knows exactly what they're accountable for. And we really get that full picture of how every project is actually doing while again, holding that accountability. And since it's really built into that process, we don't lose those updates. People really take responsibility for that data that they submit, and issues help to surface a little bit earlier on in the process rather than 6 months later. And that consistency, it didn't really come again from adding more people. It came from making accountability part of that rhythm of the organization.
Yeah. So if you take nothing else today, no unowned goals, 0. Accountability is the cheapest performance lever you can ever pull. Okay, thanks for all the questions and keep them coming. I'm going to push us forward a little bit because this final megatrend is about rhythm. Organizations that maintain a strategic cadence outperform those that just run on adrenaline. Let me quickly explain. So when you look at this slide, the dark blue, this is where projects start. And the light blue, this is where projects end. So across 20,000 plans, what we saw was 2 predictable peaks. A January launch season is like execution ignition and December completions. This is where the accountability hits the road. So you can imagine for planning, this is your annual plan, all of my projects start and end, over the course of the year, right? You can also see a little mid-year peak as well. So some projects complete in June, the halfway point, which is also the end of a fiscal year that starts in July for some organizations, which is why we might also see July as, a peak start date. So you don't see many new projects starting at the end of a quarter or in the middle of the quarter or during the holidays.
Right, I think that's really helpful context. If you could flip the slide there, Ted.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. So just wanted to talk about top performers here again, right? So what we've also seen as part of the Megatrends with driving this kind of cadence is that the top performers, they also standardize their project timelines. So that's usually somewhere around 9 to 12 months. We see that as being the sweet spot where things get done without burning out your staff, right? You could also see within this chart that early in COVID, you saw that everything kind of compressed down into 6 months because people were really laser focused on what they could control in the moment. After things started to settle a little bit, it naturally kind of ballooned back up to about a year there at the end of that line chart.
Right, and this slide really backs that up. There's a lot here, so I'll just kind of break that down. But you can see from that login and update data that we list right there in the middle that Q1 is really where organizations put a ton of energy into launching projects, as we've mentioned. But without a clear cadence, that momentum doesn't really carry through the rest of the year. I actually saw this with a banking client that I work with. They used to launch projects consistently. So the team would identify priorities and they just add them up to the project queue. Created a lot of activity, but not a lot of completion. But we shifted them into kind of more of a structured wave approach. So January, July, October, everything kind of snapped into place from there. So once resources aligned and were distributed throughout the year, teams knew exactly what phase they were in, and their progress ended up really mirroring the same kind of dual peak pattern that we really saw on that previous slide and help them really distribute their resources effectively across the year. And then in addition to that, we really help them lock into that rhythm into ClearPoint as well, with scheduling updates and reminders. And within a year, about over 70% of their projects were really launching in those waves I just spoke about. And this also came in stride with their completion rates hitting those record levels that they hadn't seen previously. So Cadence isn't just that scheduling tool; it's really going to help drive that execution at an organization.
Yeah, before we get into what leaders must do now, we did get another question online. Does our data break down kind of across different geographical regions and the high and low performers? How do we think these organizations, the execution, compares across regions? So for this first slice of our data, we did not do it geographically. We did it by industry, and we did see a lot of those energy and utility organizations with a higher execution rate than others. But it's certainly a good idea because as we come to the end of this year, we're going to pull our 2025 data into this report and update it. So we'll have that opportunity to look at the data in different ways. So thanks for the question. So in thinking about this timing and reporting, right? I think one of the big takeaways is that strategy should take place all year, right? Not just in January and December, right? So, as a best practice, I think you should consider some shorter projects so you can see quicker results, maybe putting key milestones or gates to your bigger projects throughout the year so that you can look at them, start on a quarterly basis so you can make sure you're getting the results that you want. And then you can adjust each quarter rather than wait until the end of the year or midway through the year to understand that this project isn't working, right? And then the same way Marisa described it. So consider having several wave launches. So maybe you're doing brainstorming throughout the year, but you're not starting those projects chaotically. You're looking at particular moments in time where you can say, okay, Do we have the bandwidth? Have we closed off enough projects? Let's look at our resources. Can we launch new projects at the beginning of the next quarter? And so then thinking about launching them several times a year. And this is really the discipline of managing projects that matters.
Yeah, Ted, I think it's all about the cadence, right? One smaller city that we work with down in North Carolina, so there's someone down in Wake that I chatted through earlier, that they really, when they first came to us, they were launching projects whenever they felt like someone had a really good idea, right? There was no real structure to it, just launching projects on a whim. So we worked with them and tried to kind of formalize their cadence of launching projects on a quarterly launch cycle. And what we saw there was a pretty immediate difference, right? In terms of adoption and project completion. Departments knew when to plan, right? When they needed to execute, when they needed to wrap up. And their completion rate, I want to say, jumped somewhere around like 22%, just by adding that kind of like cadence of predictability into their process.
Awesome. Great example, Ryan. Okay, last slide. So let's wrap up, right? So we talked about 4 different trends that we can see in the data across these 20,000 plans, right? There's an execution opportunity, right? You need to finish what you start. And remember that phrase, systems beats heroics, right? And then the focus premium, less, better, faster, cut to the vital few. Then the accountability advantage. Ownership is free and it triples results. So make sure you have like the 0 unowned goals, right? And then the cadence competency. So strategic rhythm beats these sporadic sprints. Together, they explain this 7x performance gap that we see between average and elite organizations. And the good news, every one of these is within your control and pretty straightforward.
Yeah, and I've over the past couple of weeks, I've been talking prospects through all these benchmarks, right? And I think people really get it. You could see the light bulb go on. They realize that like strategy execution, it's not about luck or kind of being the hero. It's about a repeatable system that they can build off of.
Yeah, Ryan. And then for customers, once you apply these really 4 forces inside of ClearPoint, you see it in those real numbers: the high completion, fewer fire drills, and more confidence.
Yes. Thank you, Ryan and Marisa, for sharing these insights on how this data really looks in the wild. And thanks to all of you for joining. We'll be sending a meeting recording along with a more detailed report of the data so you can benchmark your organizations this week. So let's go close that execution gap. And happy reporting.
Perfect. Thank you all.